Some games are remembered for what happened on the field. Others are remembered for what they took away. Miami. Ohio State. Two programs that were never supposed to collide this way, and once they did, college football was never the same. This story doesn't begin with a kickoff. It begins with two very different ideas of what power looks like in America. College football has always been about more than football. It's about geography, class, culture, and few matchups expose that truth like Miami versus Ohio State. Miami was born in heat, a city shaped by migration, pressure, and survival. Ohio State was built in structure, a program shaped by order, repetition, and institutional dominance. They didn't just play the game differently. They believed in different versions of success. Miami football was never polite. It didn't wait its turn. It didn't ask permission. In the early years, Miami wasn't supposed to matter. No historic dominance. No generational privilege. What they had was hunger. Players who carried the weight of proving something, to scouts, to coaches, to a system that often ignored them. That hunger showed up on the field. They played fast. They hit hard. They celebrated louder than anyone else. Not because they were arrogant, but because they refused to be invisible. And that refusal made people uncomfortable. Miami broke unwritten rules. They celebrated before the whistle. They talked before they were crowned. They didn't look like the image college football wanted to project. To their fans, Miami represented pride. To critics, they represented disrespect. But beneath the criticism was fear. Fear that the old order could be challenged, and beaten, by something louder, faster, and unapologetic. Miami didn't just win. They dominated. National titles. NFL talent stacked year after year. A reputation that followed opponents into the tunnel. But with every victory came resentment. Because success without approval feels threatening. And Miami didn't care who approved. Ohio State didn't disrupt college football. They embodied it. While Miami rose suddenly, Ohio State endured. This was a program built on repetition. On process. On doing things the right way. Players rotated in. Coaches adjusted. The results stayed the same. Winning wasn't an event at Ohio State. It was an expectation. Ohio State represented stability. To fans, to media, to the sport itself. They were predictable in the best way. Recruit. Develop. Win. And because they fit the system so well, the system trusted them. Trust creates influence. Influence creates protection. And protection creates power. Miami believed football was emotion. Ohio State believed football was execution. Miami believed intimidation was earned. Ohio State believed respect was assumed. Neither was wrong. But they were incompatible. For years, these programs existed in separate worlds. Different conferences. Different expectations. Different definitions of greatness. But college football has a way of forcing collisions. And as Miami's swagger grew and Ohio State's dominance continued, the question became unavoidable. What happens when rebellion meets the establishment? By the time they were placed on a collision course, the narrative was already written. Miami was framed as chaos. Ohio State as control. One was exciting. The other was reliable. And reliability always believes it will win. This wasn't just about a championship. It was about legitimacy. Miami wanted recognition without assimilation. Ohio State wanted confirmation that order still ruled. Both believed the outcome would validate everything they stood for. As the game approached, the tension was quiet. Not trash talk. Not theatrics. Something heavier. Because both sides knew, whether they admitted it or not. This game wouldn't end cleanly. And when the night finally arrived, college football would discover something uncomfortable. Some games don't just decide winners. They create scars. When the night finally arrived, it didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a reckoning. The stadium was loud, but underneath the noise was tension, the kind that doesn't come from rivalry, but from inevitability. Two programs carrying years of identity were about to collide in a single game. And no one would leave unchanged. The field was perfect. The lights were blinding. The stakes were absolute. A national championship. But this wasn't just a game played between two teams. It was a referendum. On style. On culture. On which version of college football would be allowed to define the future. Miami didn't soften themselves for the moment. They didn't adjust their image. They didn't quiet their energy. They walked into the stadium with the same confidence, some would say defiance, that had carried them through an entire season. To Miami, this wasn't arrogance. This was survival instinct. They had learned long ago that if you wait for approval, you never get it. Ohio State didn't need theatrics. They arrived with structure. With calm. With the belief that preparation always outlasts emotion. They trusted the system. They trusted the playbook. They trusted the idea that discipline eventually breaks chaos. And history suggested they were right. The game began like a chess match played at full speed. Every hit echoed. Every yard mattered. Miami's speed was obvious. Ohio State's precision was undeniable. Neither team blinked. Because blinking first meant more than losing a game. It meant losing identity. Minutes passed. Quarters passed. And still, nothing. No collapse. No runaway lead. Every time one team surged forward, the other answered. It was as if the game itself refused to choose a side. And as the tension stretched, the pressure shifted away from the players. Toward something else. In most games, officials are invisible. In this one, they became unavoidable. Not because of obvious mistakes. Not because of chaos. But because of silence. Because every borderline moment felt heavier than it should. Every flag, or lack of one, was scrutinized. The crowd didn't just react. They waited. By the fourth quarter, the game no longer felt fast. It felt dense. Every snap carried consequence. Every decision felt irreversible. Players weren't just reacting. They were calculating. Coaches weren't just calling plays. They were choosing legacies. Miami struck first. Ohio State answered. Ohio State pushed forward. Miami refused to yield. This wasn't domination. This was resistance. And resistance is exhausting. The final seconds of regulation arrived without resolution. No winner. No collapse. Just exhaustion. And disbelief. Because everyone in the stadium understood the truth. This game couldn't end cleanly. Overtime doesn't feel real. It's football stripped of context, no clock, no patience, no margin. Just survival. Miami struck. Ohio State responded. The pressure multiplied. Because now, there would be no explanation. Only judgment. Ohio State had the ball. The end zone was close enough to feel inevitable and far enough to feel cruel. Every eye locked onto the same space. Every breath held. The quarterback dropped back. The receiver broke toward the corner of the end zone. A defender closed the gap. Contact. A stumble. A moment that lasted less than a second and would be argued for decades. Yellow. On the turf. Time stopped. Not metaphorically. Literally. At first, no one understood. Players looked around. Fans screamed questions into the night. Because the moment didn't feel decisive. It felt ambiguous. And ambiguity is dangerous in championship games. Defensive pass interference. Automatic first down. Ball placed inches from glory. Miami players froze. Not in anger. In disbelief. Ohio State players didn't celebrate yet. They waited. Because they understood the weight of what had just happened. One play later, it was over. Touchdown. Game. Championship. The stadium erupted. But not uniformly. One half screamed joy. The other stood still. Because something felt unresolved. Not just the call. The meaning. Miami players dropped to their knees. Not because they were defeated. But because they felt something had been taken without explanation. Ohio State celebrated carefully. Because even in victory, they could feel the tension. Was it the right call? Within minutes, the narrative fractured. Some said the rules were applied correctly. Others said context was ignored. But everyone agreed on one thing. This game would not be remembered for how it was played. Only for how it ended. Because it wasn't just a call. It was authority stepping in at the most fragile moment possible. And once authority intervenes, trust becomes the real casualty. Miami didn't storm the field. They didn't explode in anger. They walked. And that silence said more than shouting ever could. Ohio State held the trophy. Smiled for cameras. Answered questions. But even then, they couldn't escape the shadow of the moment. Because championships earned under dispute never fully belonged to the winner. The lights shut off. The stadium emptied. But the argument had only begun. And in the days that followed, the game transformed into something far more dangerous than a result. It became a symbol. The game ended on the scoreboard. But nowhere else. By sunrise, the footage was everywhere. Paused. Zoomed. Replayed frame by frame. The moment of contact. The defender's hand. The receiver's stumble. America wasn't asking who won. America was asking who decided. Sports radio didn't debate strategy. They debated legitimacy. Former players spoke in absolutes. Officials spoke in language. Fans spoke in emotion. And emotion always travels faster. Technically, the call could be defended. That was the problem. Because technical correctness doesn't always feel like justice. And when justice feels absent, people start searching for motives. To Miami, this wasn't just one play. It was a pattern. Years of being labeled undisciplined. Years of being treated as outsiders. Years of watching the benefit of the doubt go elsewhere. The call felt familiar. And familiarity hurts more than surprise. To Ohio State, the reaction felt unfair. They didn't throw the flag. They didn't write the rules. They executed when given the chance. Yet suddenly, their championship came with an asterisk they never asked for. Winning didn't feel like relief. It felt like defense. Some outlets framed it as correct officiating. Others framed it as interference in its purest form. But the loudest voices weren't neutral. They never are. Because outrage drives engagement. And engagement keeps stories alive. Years passed. Players graduated. Coaches moved on. But the play remained. Reposted every off-season. Referenced in every officiating debate. Invoked whenever fairness was questioned. It became shorthand. A symbol. This wasn't just about Miami or Ohio State anymore. It was about power in college football. Who benefits from ambiguity? Who suffers from interpretation? Who the system protects when everything is on the line? After that game, officiating quietly changed. More reviews. More guidelines. More emphasis on clarity. Not because the system admitted failure, but because the noise wouldn't stop. When Miami players spoke about it, their voices softened, but never settled. They didn't talk about anger. They talked about disbelief. Because anger fades, disbelief lingers. Ohio State players spoke with restraint. They acknowledged the controversy, but they defended the outcome. Because once history records a winner, there is no appeal. Decades later, Miami versus Ohio State still spikes in searches. Not during championships. Not during rivalry week. But during moments of controversy. Because people don't search for closure. They search for validation. Older fans remember where they were. Younger fans discover it online. Different generations, same reaction. Wait, that's how it ended. And that reaction keeps the story alive. Because the game exposed something uncomfortable. That outcomes aren't always earned equally. That authority isn't always neutral. That systems favor familiarity. And once people see that, they can't unsee it. At some point, facts stop mattering. Emotion takes over. Miami became the robbed giant. Ohio State became the beneficiary. Reality sits somewhere in between. But stories don't survive on balance. They survive on feeling. At some point, facts stop mattering. Emotion takes over. Miami became the robbed giant. Ohio State became the beneficiary. Reality sits somewhere in between. But stories don't survive on balance. They survive on feeling. If the flag isn't thrown, Miami might win. If the call stands forever, Ohio State keeps the trophy. Both things can be true. And that tension is why this game refuses to fade. Because deep down, this wasn't about football. It was about power, identity, and who controls the narrative. And those stories never age. Some games crown champions. Others expose the system that crowns them. Miami versus Ohio State did both. And that's why it never really ended. If stories like this matter to you, stories that go deeper than the headlines, then stay here. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that history never finished telling.